Stir gently, dear. Let the flavors meld.
Like this?
Perfect. That's my girl.
It smells amazing.
Thanks, Preston. This one has always meant so much.
By the time Preston Duval lifted his champagne glass, 200 people had already decided I was the help. Then my oldest friend smiled at his future in-laws, pointed toward the woman who had fed them all night, and turned 20 years of my life into entertainment. And now she's here, he said, raising his glass toward me, still serving us dinner. Some people just aren't built for more than what they started with. No offense, Ivy. Somebody has to make the shrimp taste good. The laughter was soft, polished, and cruel. I stood beneath a crystal chandelier with a pitcher of ice water in my hand, wearing the chef's coat I had earned and the gold thistle brooch my grandmother had left me. Across the ballroom, a man in black set down an untouched glass. The tiny click against marble silenced the room before he ever spoke. "I believe," he said, looking directly at Preston, "you have mistaken the most valuable woman here for someone beneath you." That was the moment my humiliation stopped belonging to the people who had arranged it. My name is Ivy Calloway. I was 29 years old, owner of the Calloway table, and for 6 years I had built my company one wedding, one gala, and one heartbreak at a time. Before that night ended, a feared Korean Mafia boss would announce that I was the woman he intended to ask to become his wife. But the reason he knew my name began 50 years earlier, with my grandmother, a bleeding stranger, and a debt neither family had been able to forget. To understand why Preston's words cut as deeply as they did, you have to understand that he had never been just a client, a neighbor, or an old classmate. He had been my best friend for almost 20 years, the person I once believed would still be standing beside me when everyone else had gone. And 6 hours before he humiliated me under that chandelier, I still believed him. Preston Duval and I grew up 3 houses apart on the same cracked sidewalk in a part of town that doesn't show up on postcards. His mother, Diane, worked 2 jobs. My grandmother, Odessa, raised me alone after my parents died in a car accident when I was 6, and raised me on faith, second-hand furniture, and a stubbornness that I didn't appreciate until I was old enough to need it myself. She worked 30 years as a nurse before she retired, and she used to say that the hardest part of the job was never the blood. It was learning to treat every single person who came through those doors like they mattered, whether they could pay their bill or not, whether they said thank you or spit at you on their way out. "You don't get to decide who deserves your best work," she told me once, standing over my shoulder while I burned my first attempt at a roux, refusing to let me throw it out and start over. "You fix what you can and you finish what you started. That's the whole job, baby. Everything else is just garnish." I didn't understand, at 12 years old, that she was teaching me how to run a business. I only understood it 15 years later, the first time a client tried to walk out on an invoice, and I found myself repeating her words back to him, word for word, like they'd been waiting inside me the whole time. Preston and I were inseparable the way only 2 lonely kids can be. He was the one who taught me to ride a bike. I was the one who wrote his college essays when his hands shook too badly from anxiety to type them himself. We called ourselves family long before either of us understood what that word would cost. For 20 years, I believed him. I remember the summer he broke his arm falling off the fence behind the Baptist church 2 streets over, and how my grandmother set up a card table on our porch and fed him red beans and rice every single day until his cast came off because his mother was working doubles at the hospital and couldn't take the time off to fuss over a 12-year-old boy. I remember standing in a school hallway the day his father packed a duffel bag and left for good, watching Preston pretend nothing was wrong in front of everyone else, and being the only person he let see him cry about it that night in my grandmother's kitchen over a bowl of peach cobbler that went cold because neither of us could stop crying long enough to eat it. We used to say we'd grow old on that same block, that whatever happened to either of us, the other one would still be standing there when it did. I believed that the way you believe things you've never had a reason to question. I didn't know yet that people can love who you used to be and still resent who you've become, and that both feelings can live in the same chest without one ever announcing itself to the other. By the time we were adults, Our lives had split in ways neither of us planned. Preston went into finance, chasing rooms with better lighting and softer carpets, and I stayed in kitchens, chasing something quieter, the particular kind of pride that comes from making something with your own two hands and watching it feed people who will never know your name. He climbed. I built. And somewhere in the climbing, Preston started to need something from people like the Whitfields more than he needed the truth about where he came from. Kayla Whitfield was the reason. Her father, Randall Whitfield, ran a logistics empire that moved freight across 3 continents, and Diane Duval had spent 18 months maneuvering her son into that family's orbit like it was a military campaign. When Preston finally proposed, I was one of the first people he called. I remember exactly where I was standing my walk-in cooler, elbow deep in a wedding order for someone else's happy ending when he said, "Ivy, I need you to cater the engagement dinner. Family rate. You're the only person I trust." I should have heard what he wasn't saying. Family rate meant I would barely clear my costs. Family rate meant 6 months of my summer booked around a favor he'd never once offered to repay. But I said yes, because that's what 20 years of friendship does to a person it makes you believe the debt runs both ways, right up until the moment you find out it never did. I should have recognized the danger in being loved only as long as I remained useful. But history can disguise disrespect as loyalty, especially when the person holding the knife is someone who once helped bandage your knees. So I accepted Preston's invitation, rearranged half my summer, and walked into the Whitfield estate, believing I was doing one final favor for family. The Whitfield estate sat on 11 acres outside the city, the kind of property where the hedges were trimmed into shapes and the staff wore earpieces. I arrived at 2 in the afternoon with my crew, 4 people I trusted with my life and my invoices, and by 6, the ballroom looked like something out of a magazine. Ivory linens, gold candlelight, a raw bar that had taken me 3 days to source properly. I stood in the service hallway at 6:15, checking my chef's coat one last time, and I touched the small gold brooch pinned just under the collar, the way I always did before a big service. It was shaped like a thistle, tarnished at the edges no matter how many times I polished it, and it was the only thing I owned that had belonged to my grandmother before she belonged to me. Odessa never explained where it came from. She only ever said, "Somebody important gave that to your great-grandmother, baby, and one day the story will find you." I used to think that was just something old women said to make ordinary objects feel like magic. I didn't know yet how wrong I was. By 7, the guests had arrived, and I learned within the first 10 minutes exactly where I stood in that room. Diane Duval found me near the raw bar, air-kissed a spot 2 inches from my cheek, and said, loud enough for the nearest cluster of Whitfield cousins to hear, "Oh, isn't this sweet Preston hired his little neighborhood friend to do the food?" Little neighborhood friend. 6 years of licenses, insurance, a staff of 12 on my payroll during peak season, and in Diane's mouth I became a hobby Preston had been generous enough to indulge. I smiled, because that's what you learn to do in this business. You smile, and you refill the oyster ice, and you let people underestimate you while you count the ways they're wrong. Kayla Whitfield never looked at me directly the entire night. Not once. She looked past me, through me, at the food I'd built with my own hands as though it had assembled itself. Her father, Randall, shook hands with every man in a suit and never once acknowledged that a woman in a chef's coat had made the dinner he was about to take credit for in front of his business associates. Around 8, Kayla did approach me the only time all night, but not to speak to me the way you speak to a person. She held up an empty champagne flute in my direction without breaking off her conversation with a cousin beside her, the way you'd hold a glass up to a passing server whose face you had no intention of learning. I refilled it. She never said thank you, never looked down, never once acknowledged that the woman refilling her glass had grown up 3 houses down from the man she was about to marry. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I had been in this business 6 years, and I had refilled 1,000 glasses for 1,000 people who never said thank you, and none of it had ever cost me anything before. I didn't understand yet how much cheaper it is to absorb 100 small cruelties from strangers than it is to absorb one large one from somebody who is supposed to love you. And then there was the man by the window. I noticed him around 7:30, the way you notice a single still object in a room full of motion. Everyone else at that party was performing, laughing too loud, leaning too close, angling for a better seat at whatever table mattered most. He wasn't performing anything. He stood near the tall windows with a glass of something he never seemed to drink, dressed sharper than every other man in that ballroom without trying to look like he was trying, and he watched the room the way I watch a kitchen during service, like he already knew exactly how it was going to go wrong and exactly who was going to be standing when it did. I didn't know his name yet. I want you to remember that, too, because in a few minutes, his name was going to become the only thing anyone in that ballroom could talk about. By 8:30, the toasts began. Randall Whitfield went first, the kind of speech men like him give full of the word legacy, thin on anything real. Diane followed, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief that had never once touched water. And then Preston stood, tapped his glass, and asked the room for its attention. I was refilling water glasses at table 6 when he started. I remember exactly how it felt, the particular, specific dread of hearing your own name pulled into a spotlight you never agreed to stand in. "Before I toast my beautiful fiancée," Preston said, grinning at the room, "I have to tell you all a story about my oldest friend." He gestured toward me. Every head in that ballroom turned. "This is Ivy," he said. "We grew up together. Same block, same broken-down bus stop, same everything. And I gotta be honest with you all," he laughed, and the room laughed with him before he'd even said anything funny. The way rooms do when they've decided in advance that a joke is coming. Growing up, everybody thought Ivy was going to be the one who made it out first. Straight A student. Talked about culinary school like it was going to change the world. He paused. Let the silence stretch just long enough. She used to talk about opening a restaurant with white tablecloths, real reviews, her name on the awning. Preston went on, and I watched Randall's cousins lean in, delighted, the way people lean in for a story that's already been signalled as funny. Big dreams. I used to believe every word of it, too. That's the thing about growing up next to somebody you believe in them a little longer than the world's gonna let you. And now she's here, 20 years later, still serving us dinner. Preston raised his glass toward me, smiling like he'd handed me a gift instead of a wound. Some people just aren't built for more than what they started with. No offense, Ivy. Somebody's got to make the shrimp taste good, right? The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the small, comfortable laughter of a room full of people who had already decided who I was before I ever poured a single glass of champagne. And Preston had just given them permission to say it out loud. I want to tell you I said something devastating in that moment. I didn't. I stood there with a pitcher of ice water in my hand, in a room full of people who could buy and sell my entire company without checking their bank balance, and I felt every single one of Diane's air kisses and every one of Kayla's blank stares reassemble themselves into a single, unmistakable message. You do not belong here, and you never did. If you've ever been humiliated by someone who used to know all your secrets, someone who knew exactly which words would land the deepest, because you'd trusted them with the map type your city in the comments right now, I want to see how far this feeling travels, because I promise you, you are not the only one sitting in a room tonight, still smiling, still pouring the water, while somebody you loved cashes in your dignity for a laugh. I set the pitcher down. My hands were steady. 20 years of composure doesn't break in one moment, even when it should. I looked at Preston, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in a decade, and I understood something with total clarity. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. This was who he'd become, dressed up in the boy I used to know. And that was when the man by the window finally moved. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply set his untouched glass down on the windowsill, and the click of crystal against marble carried further across that ballroom than Preston's entire toast had. "I'd like to say something," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the particular quality of a voice that had never once needed to be loud to be obeyed. The room's attention swung toward him the way a compass swings north instantly, and without anyone deciding to do it. Randall Whitfield's smile flickered. "Of course, Mr. Kang, please, Kang." I filed the name away, still not understanding what it would come to mean. He crossed the ballroom slowly, and every step he took seemed to rearrange the air in the room. He stopped beside me, not behind me, not in front of me, beside me, the way you stand next to someone you intend to be counted alongside, and he looked at Preston with an expression so calm it was almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You said some people aren't built for more than what they started with," he said. "I'd like to correct you, because I think you have the wrong woman standing in front of you tonight." Preston's smile was still frozen on his face, The way a smile stays frozen right before someone realizes the joke has stopped being funny. "I've been a client of Ivy Calloway's company for 14 months, Kang said. "Not this dinner, I mean her actual business. Corporate events, private functions. Some of the most important evenings my company has hosted this year, catered by a woman I have never once had to worry about, because everything she touches, she finishes better than she found it." He paused and let his gaze move slowly across the room, across Diane's frozen handkerchief, across Randall's tightening jaw, across Kayla's parted lips. "I flew in tonight because I was told this dinner mattered to people I do business with. I didn't expect to find the best vendor I have in this entire country serving water to a room that doesn't know her name. I felt my pulse in my ears." Nobody in that ballroom moved. Then Kang turned toward me, and the authority in his face changed. It did not disappear. It became careful. For the first time that night, someone powerful looked at me without deciding in advance what I should be worth to him. "My name is Jiho Kang," he said, quiet enough that the words felt meant for me even with 200 people listening. "And first, I owe you an apology. I intended to introduce myself privately. I will not let this room force you into an answer you were never given the dignity to consider." He looked back at Preston. "For 14 months, I have watched Ivy Calloway build something extraordinary without asking anyone here for permission, rescue events other companies nearly ruined, protect her staff when it cost her money, and finish every contract better than she found it. I came tonight intending to ask for the chance to court her properly, because she is the woman I hope will one day choose to become my wife." A breath moved through the ballroom. Jiho did not look away from me. Whether she ever says yes is entirely hers to decide. What is not open for discussion is her value, her dignity, or the respect owed to her in any room where my name carries weight. Then he faced the Whitfields and the Duvals again. "So remember this clearly. Ivy Calloway is the woman I intend to earn a future with. Any person who reduces her to the help will discover how quickly my family loses interest in doing business with theirs. I have relived that silence 100 times since. It wasn't the silence of shock, exactly, though there was plenty of that. It was the silence of an entire room recalculating, in real time, every small cruelty they'd allowed themselves 20 minutes earlier, and realizing there was no way to take a single one of them back. I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't feel triumphant in that moment. I felt like the floor had opened under my feet, and I was falling into a story I hadn't agreed to be part of. But I want you to keep listening, because the announcement in that ballroom wasn't the ending of my humiliation. It was only the first door swinging open onto a hallway I never knew existed, one that led all the way back to my grandmother, to a debt older than my own life, and to exactly how far people like the Whitfields and the Duvals would go once they understood what they'd almost lost. Randall Whitfield recovered his composure first, because men like Randall are built to recover composure the way other people are built to breathe. He laughed a short, startled sound and said, "Well, this is quite an evening," as if Jiho had announced a strategic partnership instead of his intention to court me, as if I were an overlooked asset that had suddenly appreciated in value before his eyes. I would later understand that this was almost exactly how Randall saw people. Diane Duval's face moved through confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally something close to fear. She had spent a decade curating her son's proximity to power, and she had just watched the most powerful man in the room place his reputation beside the woman she had spent the evening treating like furniture while making it clear that even he did not own my answer. Preston didn't say anything at all. He stood there with his glass still raised from his toast, and for one long moment, the boy I used to know, the one who used to sit on my grandmother's porch steps and tell me I was the only person who ever made him feel like he mattered, flickered somewhere behind his eyes. And then it was gone, replaced by something smaller and more frightened. And I understood that whatever Preston felt in that moment, it wasn't concern for me. It was the sudden, sick understanding that he had just humiliated the one person in the room who apparently outranked everyone else in it. Jiho didn't wait for the room to finish processing. He simply turned to me and said, quietly, "You don't have to stay for the rest of this dinner. My car is outside whenever you're ready." I set down my apron in front of 200 people who, 20 minutes earlier, hadn't known my last name, and I walked out of that ballroom with my spine straighter than it had been in years. I remember the cool air hitting my face on the front steps of the estate and thinking, absurdly, that I should go back for my knife roll. The same knife roll I'd carried into 100 kitchens before that one. The only tool in my life that had never once needed anyone's permission to work properly. I didn't go back for it. Somebody from Jiho's team retrieved it for me the next morning, cleaned and wrapped exactly the way I would have wrapped it myself, and I understood, holding it in my own kitchen the following day, that whatever else was happening to my life, somebody had finally started paying attention to the details nobody ever thought to notice. I walked down those front steps with my face still hot and my chest still aching. But each step put more distance between me and the version of myself that had kept mistaking endurance for loyalty. Humiliation does not disappear simply because a powerful man interrupts it. What changes is the moment you finally believe you are allowed to leave. If you have ever stayed too long in a room that kept making you smaller, subscribe before we go any further. Not because Jiho rescued me, he did not, but because stories about women choosing their dignity after betrayal deserve to be finished. Somewhere, another woman is still holding the water pitcher, smiling through the insult, and wondering whether walking away will cost her everything. I need her to see what happened after I put mine down. The car Jiho had mentioned turned out to be a black sedan waiting at the base of the estate's circular drive, and he didn't get in beside me right away. He walked me to the door, opened it himself instead of letting the driver do it, and then stood there for a moment in the cold evening air, like he was deciding how much of the truth I could hold at once. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "and I'd rather give it to you somewhere that isn't a driveway." We ended up at a small, private dining room above a restaurant he apparently owned a stake in, not flashy, not performative, just quiet, with good light and better food than anything served at the Whitfield estate that night. I sat across from him with my hands wrapped around a cup of tea I didn't drink, and I asked him the only question that mattered. Why me? Jiho was quiet for a moment, turning his own cup slowly on its saucer. "My grandfather," he said finally, "was a man named Dae-sung Kang. In 1979, he came to this country on business that was more dangerous than anyone in his family understood at the time. There was an attempt on his life outside a hotel in Atlanta. He was shot and bleeding, and the men who did it assumed he wouldn't survive the night. I felt something cold move through my chest, though I didn't yet know why. He was brought into an emergency room by a stranger who found him in an alley and refused to leave his side." Jiho continued. "A young nurse who didn't ask who he was, didn't ask why armed men kept circling the block outside, and didn't accept a single dollar of the fortune my family tried to offer her afterward. She only took one thing." His eyes moved, briefly, to the collar of my chef's coat, still folded over my arm. A small gold brooch. It had belonged to my grandmother, who died 2 years earlier. My grandfather said the nurse admired it once, in passing, and he pressed it into her hand because it was the only thing he had on him that felt like it was worth what she'd done. My hand found the thistle-shaped pin before I'd consciously decided to reach for it. "He used to tell the story every year on the anniversary," Jiho said. I heard it so many times as a boy I could recite it in my sleep. A woman in a white uniform, maybe 22 years old, kneeling on a concrete floor in an alley behind a hotel, pressing her own cardigan against a bullet wound because the ambulance was still 4 minutes out, telling a man she'd never met, in a language he barely spoke, that he was not allowed to die on her watch. My grandfather said he'd built an empire on 3 continents by the time he passed, and the only thing he was ever certain he'd done right in his entire life was survive that night because of a stranger who had absolutely nothing to gain by saving him. Her name, Jiho said, was Odessa Calloway. I don't think I breathed for several seconds. My grandmother's voice came back to me across 20 years. Somebody important gave that to your great-grandmother, baby. And one day the story will find you, except she'd gotten one detail wrong. Or maybe she'd simplified it for a 6-year-old who wasn't ready for the whole truth. It wasn't her mother the story belonged to. It was her. My grandfather never forgot her, Jiho said. He spent years trying to find her again, to properly repay what she'd done. But she'd moved, changed jobs, and by the time his people tracked down a Calloway in this city, it was you running a catering company, building something out of nothing, with your grandmother's brooch pinned to your coat in every photograph on your website. You've been watching my website? I have been your client for 14 months, he said. Every contract came through a holding company because I did not know how to approach a woman my family owed without making the work feel like charity. The rates were yours. The bids were competitive. You earned every renewal. He watched my expression carefully. I saw you rebuild a walk-in freezer from your own savings, refuse a client who wanted you to hide an allergen, protect an employee after a costly mistake, and finish every event better than you found it. I told myself I was only verifying the character of Odessa Calloway's granddaughter. Somewhere along the way, the debt stopped being the reason I kept looking. He took a small leather folio from his jacket and slid it across the table. Inside was a photograph, creased soft at the corners from decades of handling a young woman in a white nurse's uniform, standing outside a hospital entrance, her expression somewhere between exhaustion and defiance, a small gold thistle brooch already pinned crooked to her collar. I had never seen a photograph of my grandmother that young in my life. My hands shook holding it. My grandfather had this taken the week it happened, Jiho said quietly. He kept it in his desk for the rest of his life. When he died, it was the only personal item he left specific instructions for. He wanted it delivered to whoever found Odessa's family, so they would know he never stopped being grateful. He watched me trace the photograph. I know how this looks. A stranger routed legitimate contracts through holding companies, studied your work, and then spoke about marriage before properly introducing himself. I have turned this conversation over 100 times trying to find a version that does not sound alarming. There is not one. I can give you the records, answer every question, and accept whatever distance you require. The decision is yours. Odessa's name changed the meaning of everything I had carried into that ballroom. The brooch, the work, the instinct to finish what I started. I finally understood that quiet women can build futures without applause, and their choices may keep traveling long after they are gone, changing lives. I did not fall into Jiho Kang's arms because his grandfather owed my grandmother a debt, and I did not accept the future he had announced simply because a ballroom had watched him announce it. I set Odessa's photograph on the table and told him plainly that he had defended my dignity while nearly taking my choice out of my hands. You cannot correct a man for speaking over me and then decide my future in the next breath, I said. Jiho did not excuse himself with good intentions. He did not tell me I should be grateful. You are right, he answered. I wanted to stop them from reducing you, and I used the largest promise I had without considering that it could reduce you differently. What happens if I never want to see you again? Then I make sure your contracts remain untouched, return every record connected to your family, and never enter your life without permission. That answer did not make me trust him. It did make me willing to keep listening. The following Monday, I learned exactly who had listened. Jiho was chairman of the Kang Group's American operations logistics, private equity, commercial real estate, and a dozen legitimate companies. In newspapers, he was a disciplined heir with an instinct for distressed assets. In rooms where people lowered their voices before saying his name, he was the American head of the Kang family's older network, a Korean syndicate that had controlled routes, information, favors, and consequences for 3 generations. He was feared not because he performed violence in public, but because he rarely needed to. A contract withdrawn by Jiho Kang could close 3 doors before breakfast. A promise from him traveled farther than a threat from most men. Randall Whitfield called me personally on Wednesday. Not to apologize, Randall Whitfield did not apologize. I would come to learn. He simply recalculated, but to inform me that the Whitfield family would be honored to have the Calloway table cater any future events, and that perhaps we should discuss an ongoing arrangement, given my apparent proximity to Mr. Kang's considerable interests. I listened to him for exactly 90 seconds before I understood what was actually happening. Randall didn't want me. Randall wanted access to Jiho, and I was suddenly the door he thought he'd found. I told him I'd think about it. I did not think about it. Diane Duval sent a fruit basket. I want you to sit with that for a second, a fruit basket. The same week her son had called me unfit for more than serving shrimp in front of 200 people, arrived at my commercial kitchen with a card that read, in Diane's looping handwriting, "So proud of you, always knew you'd make it." I threw the card away. I kept the fruit because I don't waste food, but I threw the card away. Preston didn't call for 11 days. When he finally did, I almost didn't answer. I sat, looking at his name on my phone screen for 4 full rings, remembering the boy who taught me to ride a bike, remembering the man who had looked me in the eye in front of his future in-laws and turned 20 years of friendship into a punchline. And on the 5th ring, I picked up, because some part of me still needed to hear what he had to say for himself. "Ivy," he said, and his voice cracked in a way I recognized from every difficult conversation we'd ever had, all the way back to his father leaving, all the way back to his first heartbreak. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this. You had a microphone and 200 witnesses 11 days ago," I said. "You could have said it then. I know." A long pause. I panicked. "Kayla's family, you don't understand the pressure I've been under to look a certain way in front of them, to seem like I came from somewhere that matters, and you were standing right there being a reminder of exactly where I actually come from. And He stopped himself. "That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse." "No," I said. "It isn't. I've thought about that call more than almost any other conversation I had that year, because it taught me something I don't think I'd ever fully understood before, that an apology which spends more time explaining itself than owning itself isn't really an apology at all. It's just a more polite version of the same excuse, dressed up to sound like accountability." I told Preston I needed time. I did not tell him about Jiho, Odessa, or the 14 months of contracts I had earned without knowing which client stood behind the holding company. Some truths belonged only to me until I decided otherwise. What I did not know was that Preston would not give me distance gracefully. 20 years of friendship had taught him which doors in my life once opened for him, and over the following month, I watched him test every handle. It started small. A mutual friend mentioned, almost in passing, that Preston had been asking around about how serious things were with Jiho, whether it was really an engagement or just a business thing. Then Diane began showing up at events I catered, never speaking to me, just present, watching, the way you watch a stock you regret selling too early. And then, 3 weeks after the dinner, my biggest standing client, an events company that booked me for 6 galas a year, cancelled our contract with no explanation beyond a change in direction. I found out why 2 days later. A rumour had started vague, unsourced, but specific enough to do damage that the Callaway table had a history of billing irregularities, invoices that didn't match services rendered. It wasn't true. It had never been true. But rumours don't need to be true to cost you a 6-gala contract, and I spent that entire week pulling every invoice I'd issued in 3 years, preparing to defend a business I'd built with my own 2 hands against an accusation that had come from nowhere. Except it had not come from nowhere. The rumour traced back to Randall Whitfield's public relations firm, the same company that protected his logistics empire, and the same one Diane Duval had quietly contacted for a small favour after the dinner. Jiho's security team found the payment chain in less than a day. What disturbed me was not only how quickly they found it, but how calmly Jiho described the people responsible, as though he had already measured every consequence available to him and was waiting for me to choose which kind of man he would be. He came to my kitchen on Thursday evening, after my staff had gone home, and found me sitting on an overturned crate in the walk-in cooler, surrounded by 3 years of invoices. The overhead light had failed. I was checking totals by flashlight, because pride can make a woman do ridiculous things rather than admit she is frightened. "You should have called me," he said. "It is my business," I answered. "I built it before I knew you existed. I will not let the first sign of trouble turn me into a woman who waits for a powerful man to solve her life." Jiho removed his coat, folded it over a crate, and sat across from me in shirt sleeves. "Then tell me what help looks like when it does not take your authority away." It was the first question anyone had asked me since the rumour began. Everyone else had offered advice, sympathy, or rescue. Jiho offered terms. I told him I wanted the source documented, the false claims retracted, and every cancelled client given the evidence. I did not want threats, broken windows, frightened families, or anyone disappearing because they had crossed the Kang name. His eyes stayed on mine while I said it. Quietly, I told him. Legally. Completely. For a moment, the man people feared sat absolutely still inside my freezing walk-in. Then he nodded. "Your line becomes my line." He opened one of my invoice boxes, loosened his cuffs, and spent the next 3 hours helping me sort records while his attorneys prepared preservation notices for Randall's PR firm. He did not understand my filing system. I did not let him pretend he did. By midnight, we had argued over alphabetizing, eaten cold lemon tart from the staff refrigerator, and built the first honest thing between us. A boundary he had respected when ignoring it would have been easier. The danger arrived 5 nights later. I was finishing prep for a Saturday wedding when someone tested the back door handle at 11 o'clock, long after deliveries had ended. Through the service window, I watched a man walk slowly beneath the security light, stop where the camera could see his face, and remain there for 30 seconds before leaving. It was not an attempt to enter. It was a message designed to make me imagine the next one. I called the police first. Then I called Jiho. He reached the kitchen in 11 minutes, but 2 of his people arrived before him and remained outside until the officers finished taking my statement. He watched the footage once, recognized the man, and went so still that I understood why other powerful men feared his silence. He works for a subcontractor. Randall's firm uses when it wants intimidation separated from the invoice, he said. I can end this tonight. No, I said. My hands were still shaking, but my voice was not. You can stop him. You can protect my staff. You can give the footage and your evidence to the police. But you cannot turn me into the excuse you use to become something I have to fear too. Jiho looked at me for a long moment. Then he handed his phone to the detective, unlocked every relevant file, and ordered his security chief to cooperate without withholding a name. The old network beneath the Kang Group could have buried the incident. Instead, because I asked, Jiho brought it into daylight. The man under the camera was questioned the next morning. His employer severed the contract before noon. By evening, the paper trail connecting the intimidation and the billing rumor to Randall's PR firm sat with attorneys, police, and every investor who had been told the Callaway table could not be trusted. That was when Randall's collapse truly began, not with a threat from a Mafia boss, but with verified records he could not charm, buy, or erase. Jiho froze the Kang Group's port investment pending an ethics review. 2 outside investors requested the same evidence and withdrew their term sheets after reading it. Jiho never instructed them to leave. He did something more damaging. He stopped protecting Randall from the truth about his own conduct. In Randall's world, reputation moved like weather. Once the sky changed over his company, every person standing nearby found a reason to seek shelter somewhere else. Randall called me himself this time, not his assistant, not a fruit basket. Him and the man who had once offered me an ongoing arrangement now asked, in a voice considerably smaller than the one he'd used at his daughter's engagement dinner, whether there was anything he could do to clear up this misunderstanding. You could tell the truth, I said, publicly, about where that rumor came from. He did. 4 days later, Randall stood before his company's board, 2 lenders, and a bank of local cameras, and admitted that an outside firm retained by Whitfield Logistics had circulated unsupported allegations about the Callaway table. The language was careful, but the evidence was not. The PR contract, Diane's messages, and the intimidation subcontract had already been preserved. He apologized to me by name. My cancelled client called within the hour, rebooked all 6 galas before the week ended, and paid the deposits in advance. Randall had tried to erase my credibility in whispers. He was forced to restore it in public. Diane found me herself, once. Before it was over, cornered me in a parking lot outside a florist's shop, of all places, her voice pitched low and urgent the way people get when they can feel something slipping out of their hands. "You could fix this," she said. "1 word from you to Mr. Kang, and Randall's investment comes back, and none of this has to touch Preston's future. You know how much his future has always mattered to me." "His future mattered to you," I said. "Not his character. There's a difference, Diane, and I think somewhere along the way you forgot there was ever supposed to be one. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. You fed me in your kitchen for 20 years, and then let your son call me unfit to be more than the help in front of 200 strangers. And now you're standing in a parking lot, asking me to save the very deal that was going to fund the life you built by looking down on the one I built. I'm not going to fix this for you. You're going to have to sit in what you made, the same way I sat in that ballroom." She didn't have anything to say to that. I don't think anyone had said no to Diane Duval in a very long time, and I could see, watching her face, that she didn't entirely know how to stand in a version of the world where I was allowed to. Diane Duval's collapse was quieter, and in some ways worse to watch, because it happened at her own son's expense. Preston's engagement to Kayla, I learned through the same channels that carry every piece of gossip in a city like mine, had been quietly, mutually paused the same week the Whitfield Kang investment fell through. I don't believe Kayla ever loved Preston. Not really. I believe she loved what Preston represented. Proximity to a family that seemed to be climbing. And the moment that climb stalled out, so did her interest. Preston had spent a decade positioning himself to be chosen by a family that had never once intended to choose him for anything beyond what he could offer them. When he stopped being useful, he stopped being anything to them at all. He showed up at my kitchen the week the engagement ended, standing in my doorway looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, and he said the only true thing I think he'd said to me in months. "I lost everything trying to become someone you'd never have recognized," he said. "And I lost you doing it." "What did you actually lose, Preston?" I asked, and I meant it as a real question, not a cruel one. "The Whitfields? A woman who never once looked at you the way she should have looked at a man she was about to marry? A version of your own mother's approval that was always going to cost you more than it gave back?" I set down the knife I'd been using to break down a case of chicken, because some conversations deserve your full hands. "I think the only thing you actually lost was time. 20 years of it, spent trying to become someone impressive enough for people who were never going to see you as anything more than useful. I would have loved you exactly as you were. I did love you exactly as you were for a very long time. You're the one who decided that wasn't enough to build a life around." He didn't argue. That, more than anything he said that day, told me how much he'd actually changed the old Preston would have argued, would have needed me to tell him he was still a good person underneath it all. This Preston just nodded and thanked me for the time, and left, and I stood in my kitchen for a long while afterward, grieving a friendship the way you grieve anything that used to be alive. If there's one thing I want every person watching this to hear clearly, it's this: I didn't destroy Preston Duval. I didn't spread a single rumour, cancel a single contract, or say one unkind word about him to anyone who would listen. He built his own downfall, brick by brick. Out of every moment he chose someone else's approval over the people who actually loved him. That's not karma delivered by me. That's karma delivered by time, which is patient and thorough and never once needs your help. I told him I forgave him, because I did, eventually, in the quiet, unglamorous way you forgive someone you'll never fully trust again, not for his sake, but because I didn't want to carry 20 years of friendship around my neck like a debt I owed him for the privilege of once loving him. But I also told him the friendship, as it had existed, was over. Some doors closed gently. That one needed to. Diane, for her part, sent no more fruit baskets. I heard, secondhand, that she'd moved to be closer to a sister in another state, that the Duval name had quietly lost its shine in the circles she'd spent a decade trying to enter. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. I felt, mostly, tired the particular exhaustion of watching an entire structure of cruelty collapse under its own weight, slowly enough that you have time to grieve everything it cost you to survive it. My kitchen staff learned about Jiho's ballroom announcement from a phone video before I reached home. Rosalind, my sous chef since year 2, called at midnight not to ask whether I was marrying a billionaire, but whether I needed her to open the kitchen so I would not have to face anyone. That was the difference between people who valued me and people who valued proximity to me. My staff cared whether I was all right. They did not care whose future wife a stranger had declared I might become. For the next 4 months, Jiho proved he understood that distinction. He did not send diamonds, announce another decision, or place himself between me and every difficult conversation. He asked before entering my kitchen after hours. He learned the names of all 12 employees without consulting an assistant. When security became necessary, he gave Rosalind the schedule and let me approve every person posted near the building. When a client tried to speak to him instead of me at one of my own events, Jiho looked past the man and said, "Miss Calloway owns the company. Ask her." Then he stepped away. Our first real date happened in a 24-hour diner after a corporate gala because both of us had worked too late for anywhere else. He ordered coffee, I ordered pie, and for 2 hours we discussed everything except debt, business, and marriage. He told me his grandfather had taught him that fear was efficient but loyalty lasted longer. I told him my grandmother believed good work was a form of character. He admitted he had watched from a distance because observation felt safer than rejection. I told him distance had protected him while leaving me unaware that someone was studying my life. He did not defend himself. He apologized, changed the way his holding companies handled my contracts, and gave me every record connected to them. I kept the contracts I had earned. I refused the ones created only to repay his family. He accepted the difference. There were no dramatic declarations after that. There were Tuesday breakfasts before supplier meetings, quiet drives after late events, and arguments that ended with both of us still in the room. Jiho taught himself how to dice an onion without crushing it. I learned that the feared man beneath the black suits kept antacid in every car because stress had damaged his stomach years earlier. He saw me angry, exhausted, controlling, and occasionally wrong. I saw him ruthless in negotiations, painfully private, and capable of stopping when I said enough. Attraction came first. Trust came slowly. Love arrived so quietly that I recognized it only when an ordinary evening without him began to feel unfinished. One Sunday, he came with me to Odessa's church carrying folding tables because the volunteers had heard about him and refused to be impressed. Miss Bernice asked whether he knew how to stack chairs. He said no, then learned without complaint. Watching a man who could freeze a port deal take instructions from 3 retired nurses told me more than any speech in the ballroom. He was not gentle because he lacked power. He was gentle because someone had made him understand that restraint could be an act of love worth choosing freely. He proposed properly 4 months after the ballroom, not before strangers, and not as repayment for Odessa. He came to my kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday wearing an apron over a white shirt because he had insisted on cooking for me and refused to let his chef help. The sauce was terrible. The lamb was somehow both overdone and cold. I ate enough to reward the effort. Then he stood between my prep table and the walk-in freezer, took my hands instead of dropping immediately to one knee, and said, "That night, I announced a future before I had earned the right to ask whether you wanted one. I cannot undo it. I can only spend the rest of my life respecting the answer you give me now." Only then did he kneel. "Ivy Calloway, will you choose me?" I said yes in the same kitchen where I had once cried over cancelled contracts, with my grandmother's brooch pinned to my collar and Jiho's ruined dinner cooling behind us. We married the following spring in a small garden ceremony designed around the people who had actually shown up for us. No ballroom performance, no 200 strangers recalculating my value. Jiho placed photographs of Dae-sung Kang and Odessa Calloway at the head table, facing each other across 50 years and the debt that had finally come home. Preston sent a brief, honest card, wishing me a happiness he understood he had never known how to offer anyone, least of all himself. I kept that card. Some apologies are worth keeping, even from people who no longer get to keep you. The numbers tell their own story. The company that cancelled 6 galas rebooked all 6 and referred 4 more clients. The Calloway table ended the following year with 12 full-time employees, a client roster 3 times larger than it had been the night of Preston's toast, and a 6-month waiting list for anyone booking without a referral. None of that happened because Jiho married me. It happened because my work finally got to stand in the room without somebody else's voice talking over it. Jiho's name opened no door I had not already earned the right to walk through. What he gave me was the space to prove it without someone quietly locking the handle. I still check every invoice before it leaves the office. I still wear Odessa's thistle brooch to important events. And I still think about that ballroom, the picture in my hand, Preston's raised glass, the laughter, and the silence after Jiho spoke. I no longer remember it as the night a powerful man gave me value. I remember it as the night betrayal finally made me stop offering loyalty where there was no respect. My grandmother's kindness did travel back to me, but not as a reward delivered by magic. It returned as a choice. Odessa saved a stranger because his life mattered before she knew his name. Jiho honored her by learning that protecting me meant respecting my voice. And I honored her by refusing to let gratitude become another cage. That is the part I carry whenever someone says decency is wasted, good work goes unseen, or people like Randall always win. They win only while everyone else agrees to keep their secrets. So if you have ever stood in a room feeling invisible while someone who knew your heart used it against you, remember this. Being underestimated is not proof that you are small. It is evidence that the people judging you have not looked closely enough. Comment SHE chose herself for every woman who finally put down the picture, walked out with her dignity, and made power meet her on equal ground.